Welcome to Inviting Oneness, a podcast where we explore true personal stories from friends and members of EquaSion. Stories where the illusion of separateness gave way to the deeper truth of our shared humanity. My guest today is Daniel Burridge, the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Area Religious Coalition of Cincinnati, otherwise known as MARCC. Here's Danny.
My story of oneness takes me back to my time living and working in El Salvador. I was a missioner there in El Salvador for about 6 years, soon after college. And in the latter portion of those years, I was working in an urban neighborhood called the Chacra, basically considered a slum. It was one of the poorest parts of El Salvador. And, when it compared to other parts of the world, certainly it would probably qualify as one of these poorer parts that we would experience, a lot of lack of basic social services, poverty. And in those times in El Salvador, one of the biggest characteristics of these places is that it was controlled by gangs. And so this place where I worked and began to live as well was controlled by the 18th Street gang. And so the big part of my work was to actually run a after-school program, or what we ended up considering a violence prevention program there, to try to keep kids from joining the local gangs. But, the local gangs were, of course, kind of the ones in charge of the neighborhood. And so in the course of running this program, I had a lot of interaction with the local gang members. Also, in one case, I actually became pretty close to one of them. His name was Manuel, and he was just a very, very normal kid. He was probably 14 or 15 by the time I got to know him. I'd see him on the street and, we'd talk a little bit about soccer, about, the weather, about whatever, just kind of the normal sort of interaction. But at the same time, I knew, obviously, that he was also in the local gang, was involved in crimes, especially extortion, and probably all sorts of gun violence as well. And also, the connection with Manuel extended to his family. One niece and one nephew of his also came to our after-school program pretty regularly. So I worked a lot with them and had just a lot of connection with this family who, again, for the most part, was probably getting a lot of their income from the gang network and from the sort of illicit activities that the gang was involved in. But at the same time, through the local program, which was a part of the local Catholic Church, we were trying to keep some of these younger kids from going all the way into that gang network and that gang culture. But it was really hard work. It was kind of, feeling like you were always swimming upstream, pushing against a very, very strong current in those days. So the story of oneness comes because, unfortunately, Manuel was killed. And apparently, we never got the full story. It was like one day he was no longer around. He wasn't, in the normal kind of corners where he and his buddies would hang out and, do all the things that they would do. And so it turns out we heard that he had kind of been victim to some sort of like infighting amongst his gang. Wasn't rival gang, wasn't police or anything like that. It was just like something that happened within. Like he disappeared. Like there's never, a body or anything like that. And so eventually his family decided to do, a funeral and a wake and the whole kind of normal thing, even though there's no body that they ever were able to recover. So a funeral or a wake for a gang member is always kind of like a touchy thing, because it can sometimes also be a situation where the gang comes as well and gets all drunk and like starts planning revenge or, whatever the sort of situation might be. His mom, Manuel's mom, invited me to come to the wake. And so I wanted to go. I knew her, knew a lot of the family members, had known him. And so I really wanted to go, but I had another really close friend who was like, Danny, don't go to that. It's gonna, could potentially be really dangerous. It could be a situation where, again, there's going to be like gang activity going on. Anyways, I decided to go. It was a house in the neighborhood I'd never been to. It was, again, considered kind of a gang family's house. And so perhaps against another's best judgment, I went and, I went in the door and suddenly, it was just like this full house. Obviously there's a bunch of the plastic chairs set up. There was a coffin there, and again, the niece and nephew who came to my program, the mom, all the family were there, generations of folks. We've got perhaps this sense that like gang members, just join the gang and then that's their family. And sometimes that's kind of the case. But, Manuel and, had a really big family who was there to support him. And even more surprising, there was a bunch of people who were from the local Catholic Church that I had been working with, and were from even the Christian-based community that I was participating in at the time. We'd meet weekly and read the gospel and again, in the classic sort of Christian-based community tradition, try to figure out what the gospel was leading us to do in practice in that exact time and place in order to kind of put into practice the word of God. And so I saw other members of the Christian-based communities there, and that kind of really made me feel good. I was like, okay, well, there's some folks I do know and everything. And so, as the wake started getting going, one of the other ladies came up to me and asked me if I would be willing to kind of lead. There's a whole series of like praying the rosary and, praying the Hail Mary at these wakes. And so they asked me to like, lead one of the Hail Mary moments. And initially I was very, very, I was nervous already, but, kind of to lead prayer in front of all these folks was also really, really nerve-wracking. But I said yes. And so my time came up and I started, speaking the first part of the Hail Mary, and then everybody else would join in after that. And again, I was just super nervous. I'd prayed it a bunch of times before in Spanish, but like as I was doing it, it was just, this, again, I would say this sense of oneness, the sense of connectedness, the sense of community just really, really started flowing through me. And it was just such a powerful experience to know that, even though, Manuel had probably been guilty of all sorts of crimes, had hurt people, had hurt people in the neighborhood, had hurt people there who had attended his wake. People were coming together, across different religious traditions, evangelical or Catholic, folks who were probably connected with the gang network, folks who were not, realizing that, this young person did not deserve to die, something that we still needed to be able to celebrate his life and come across, bridge whatever barriers we might have had otherwise to just try to, support his family, celebrate his life. And, also just, kind of in that Salvadoran liberation theology tradition, it's like we want to be able to be sure that he is able to live on in those who survive him in the world. There's a very strong sense there in El Salvador that folks who die, and this is kind of also, the, kind of Day of the Dead, where if you truly think and remember your loved ones, the idea is that they do come back and they are kind of with you in communion on kind of the Day of the Dead and All Saints Day. Again, if you kind of put up their images and if you truly think about them and truly remember their presence in your life. And so, it was this experience of praying communally with a group who was otherwise very diverse, very kind of disparate, and coming together to remember and mourn and celebrate the life of a young person who, again, despite their issues, problems, sins, injuries against others, we all kind of recognized that we as people of faith still needed to come together to celebrate that life. So yeah, it was really, really powerful. I mean, I even overcame my own fear about, attending and was just, so glad that I did, and Manuel's mom, his niece and nephew also were just like very, very thankful, very grateful. Again, knowing that I, as kind of a worker at the parish, trying to kind of like stop gang activity, it wasn't that I was necessarily going to demonize or shun these folks at all, but rather, in the example of Jesus, the Catholic and Christian faith tradition, that those folks who would otherwise be marginalized or shunned the most are the ones that we actually need to reach out to the most. And so being a part of that allowed me, I think, to go beyond myself. I mean, my whole experience in life and work in El Salvador allowed me, I think, to come to a much clearer sense that, it's not just about me, and it's certainly not just about me helping others as much as I would like to do that, but it's a matter of like, how does the I or the me kind of just come into communion with others? That we as a group, we as a collectivity, as a community can push forward together and try to create a world where we're not losing our young people.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. The obvious question for me here is the way that you have constructed the sense of community, of oneness, seems to be in response to what potentially could be an adversarial relationship to Manuel and to the gangs. And I think this is maybe implicit within the Catholic and Christian tradition, which says something like even love of enemy is a part of the call to discipleship, the call to formation. There's a way in which I can imagine you working in this nonviolence after school program. You could easily demonize people like Manuel. Was that a struggle for you to not do that? Was it natural for you? Like, what was that process like? And were you consciously thinking through the ways that you can avoid falling into that very natural inclination?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think it was absolutely a struggle to not other the gang members who were so powerful in the neighborhood and in a lot of ways very destructive, because again, just harassing anybody who came in on a truck, they'd get extorted. I mean, folks lost their lives due to the rivalries between the gangs. And a lot of the kids, looked up to these gang members in a way that made it really hard to get younger kids kind of interested in extracurricular activities and their educational opportunities. And so it was really, really easy to see the gangs as this absolutely divisive and destructive force in the communities. But at the same time, I really was very able to see it kind of both ways, because you could also, again, see the gang members also playing soccer. They had their time during the afternoon, and we had to kind of like negotiate this with them. It's like they got the soccer court, from like starting at like 1 p.m. and then the smaller kids would get it later. And so it was also like they were absolutely humans. They're absolutely people. And in fact, my own specific case, I made a lot of stupid decisions when I was young, hoping that I'm beyond a lot of those like poor decisions. But I totally realized that if I had been born with a different set of opportunities, a different circumstance that I was born into, I could have easily gone down that path. It was only because I got a lot of second chances that I am, that I was even able to go to El Salvador to be a missioner, that I was able to get a good education, that I was able to, do the work that I'm able to do now. I had second chances. I had a great support network. I had economic opportunities. I also felt like I could identify with them. It's like when you're 14, 15, 16 years old, you're just trying to be cool. You're just trying to, do what the cool kids are doing, and so I felt like personally I could definitely identify with what gang members were going through and what they were trying to navigate in their own lives. And by extension, their families. Gang members are also members of these communities. And so there certainly were those folks, even with the Catholic Church, associated with the Christian-based communities, who did very much demonize gang members and their families, tried to sort of ignore them, not interact with them at all. But then there was a whole nother set of folks who, and I would have been with them, trying to figure out how we actually incorporate them into the community, both kind of the Catholic Christian-based community, but also into the larger social life of the neighborhood, and do that in ways that would make them feel like they have an opportunity to leave that kind of gang and more illicit sort of lifestyle. Unfortunately, like, there was not a lot of actual like economic opportunities, say like, oh, well, you can leave that and you can actually get a good job doing this. Like, that was not necessarily the case. But that's where the community itself really had to kind of step up and just like figure out ways to just be with people and hold space for them and like, collectively pursue different sorts of social and economic opportunities. And so, on one hand, it was always a struggle, to figure out how to both recognize the humanity of folks who were in this really kind of problematic lifestyle, but at the same time try to work with them and lead them in directions that could kind of lead them towards other ways. Again, recognizing that all of us have those struggles. We're all suffering temptation or suffering trauma or suffering like that potential like path towards destructive lifestyles. And so, it was really, really, really hard, but I think it still is something that right now, I mean, it's so important to still have this sense of the humanity of people who are being demonized by our wider society oftentimes, and again, it is once again very much gang members. It is undocumented immigrants. It's people who don't look like us. It's those who are others. And so I think it is very much, as people of faith, it is our calling to try to get beyond that sense of otherness and create a oneness instead, and create kind of more of a community of folks, despite whatever sort of differences we have, that we can find common ground and that our faiths lead us towards that. So that's something that I'm still certainly working on, but something that time in El Salvador with folks like Manuel and his family, I mean, provided me with a foundation that, I want to believe that there's no other that I couldn't really try to come into communion with.
There's a bunch of things here that I would love to have time to talk to you about, but I'll just say that I think some of the gifts of the Catholic tradition that you've pointed to here are things like liberation theology, the liberative mode that has infused so much of Christian thought. This idea of base communities that's happening in Latin America, I think also has been incredibly influential and powerful. We're in a moment right now where narco traffickers, Latin American gangs are being used in a lot of ways to justify some pretty harmful policies, both geopolitically and also domestically. The thing that struck me as you were talking is this idea that there really weren't a lot of options for people like Manuel beyond the gang life in that particular
Right.
neighborhood. There's a way in which you can say gangs are incredibly destructive, absolutely, that they have a very negative impact, even on our communities in some ways, if you kind of like
Mm-hmm. Sure.
scale it. And on the other side, without choice, I'm not sure. I think the moral question becomes much more complicated.
Yeah.
And so for people who are listening to you talk and thinking about the implications for folks like Manuel and the gangs that he was a part of, sort of scaled up to a much larger level, what are you hoping that people who are listening will take away from the story, especially as it relates to generating community, maybe even some of the work of MARCC that you all are doing?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say in response to all that is that by and large, street gangs, as we currently know them in, the second half of the 20th century and early 21st century, are by and large a response to poverty and a response to marginalization. The kind of quintessential gang culture, associated with Black youth, in LA or in Chicago or New York, in so many ways is a response to Black Americans being marginalized and being impoverished systematically over generations. And so trying to figure out a way to both have a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense that our group of people who have been systematically marginalized are actually worthy, we're valuable. And that also we need to figure out some way to make some money, to survive economically in really dire situations. And so that, from a very baseline, is that we all need a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of power, and need some sort of economic opportunity. And so gang activity in the broadest sense is a response to that, a response to a system that marginalizes and impoverishes and oppresses certain groups of people. And that is very different, I will say, from what is more kind of like actual organized crime. And there are some blurry lines between gang activity and organized crime sometimes, but a lot of organized crime that we see in Latin America, whether around cartels and drug trafficking, it responds to a demand for drugs in the United States. Also, an economic opportunity that oftentimes folks in poverty resort to, but there is that really clear economic incentive and demand for the product. But, in El Salvador, those gangs weren't necessarily involved in drug trafficking in that way. But kind of go back to your specific question, it's, again, absolutely that moral choice, as if we, always had this choice, well, we could just go down the criminal pathway or go towards this just very legal, like politically acceptable path towards economic prosperity. Again, that is not always there for folks in our world. And increasingly, even the middle class across the world is struggling to find those, economic opportunities forward. But yeah, in our current climate in this country, I think there seems to be a reinvigoration almost of this discourse of othering folks who might be involved in some sort of criminal activity or might be involved in, illicit gangs. And not all gangs have to be involved in criminal activity necessarily, but there's this idea that, there's this boogeyman of gangs and of drug traffickers, of illegals, of protesters, and it's all kind of getting lumped into the same group of others and un-American. But again, we need to understand that our society has produced the conditions that have given rise to these phenomena. And even, the response that our society is currently resorting to, which is kind of further militarization, further criminalization of these groups, only exacerbates the problem, because then these folks have even less that they can resort to. They don't feel like they can go to the government or to government agencies oftentimes. And so I do think that the pathway to getting beyond this process of othering those folks who have already been othered by the system, I think really does come from the sorts of experiences where people come together across their, whether it's ethnic or racial or socioeconomic boundaries, linguistic, cultural boundaries. How do we have experiences together with people that are supposedly others from us, or supposedly demonized or marginalized by the system? I think it's really hard to have compassion, to have a sense of humanity, kind of collective humanity with folks that you don't know, that you don't understand why they're doing the things that they're doing, that you don't understand it from their perspective. And so I think a big part of what we are trying to do in MARCC, the Metropolitan Area Religious Coalition of Cincinnati, and also in EquaSion, is find common ground across people of faith in order to do the work of building the common good in our society. That is truly our responsibility as people of faith. And it's so unfortunate that oftentimes, and again, this is beyond partisanship as far as I'm concerned, so often our governments are not truly working for the common good. They fall into the same sorts of processes of violence and producing inequality, of othering, of all these things that are not conducive to a flourishing and equitable society. And so I do think that we as people of faith, we can take the lead on these sorts of things. And whether it is facilitating dialogue, maybe proposing policies, setting examples, being a model for how we can actually come together across boundaries, across differences, and construct a society that's actually based on respect and on dignity and on the inherent value of our fellow human beings.
Thanks for joining us on Inviting Oneness, where we share real stories of connection that dissolve the illusion of separation and reveal our common humanity. If this episode moved you and you'd like to get involved, visit us at EquaSion.org. Until next time, may we keep inviting oneness within ourselves and with one another.